What if the three strangest clues in Silo Season 3 are actually pointing toward the same truth? A seashell-shaped symbol that keeps appearing where it shouldn't. A strange version of vitamin D+ that may be doing far more than simply erasing memories. And a Wizard of Oz connection that could explain why the people inside the silos have spent generations searching for a truth that was deliberately hidden from them. At first, these clues seem completely unrelated. One belongs to George and Juliet's story. One is connected to the silo's control system. And one looks like nothing more than a reference to an old book. But when we put them together, a much darker possibility starts to emerge. What if the silos were never designed simply to protect humanity? What if they were designed to control what humanity remembers? And if that is true, then the biggest question in episode May 7th not be what happens next to Juliet. It may be whether she has already discovered the one thing the people running the silos never wanted anyone to see. One of the easiest details to overlook in Silo is the seashell design. It first became important because of George Wilkins, but the symbol has appeared often enough that it deserves another look. The important thing here is not simply that George had the design associated with him. It is that the same visual idea keeps appearing around the story at moments when the characters are getting closer to information that has been hidden from them. And that makes the seashell much more interesting than a simple tattoo or a piece of decoration. George was obsessed with the world outside the official version of Silo history. He wanted to understand the relics, the forbidden technology, and the things that existed before the current system. Juliet eventually inherited that curiosity. She did not start out trying to destroy the system. She simply wanted answers. But every answer she found created another question. That pattern is extremely important because Silo has repeatedly shown us that knowledge itself can be dangerous inside this world. Now look at the seashell design again. The shape immediately brings to mind a path, a spiral, or something that leads inward. That may sound insignificant, but visual symbolism in Silo has never been completely random. The show constantly uses objects, drawings, maps, relics, and repeated designs to connect different parts of its mystery. So if this symbol is intentionally connected to the silo itself, then perhaps George was unknowingly closer to the truth than we realized. There is another reason this matters. Juliet has already discovered that the history presented to the people inside the silo is incomplete. The relics are not simply old objects. They are pieces of a world that existed before the current rules. Every relic carries information. Every forbidden object creates a crack in the official story. And the seashell may be another piece of that larger puzzle. This is where the Wizard of Oz connection becomes interesting. The Wizard of Oz is a story about people who believe they are being guided by a powerful figure who appears almost impossible to reach. Eventually, they discover that the person behind the curtain is not what they expected. The power comes from presentation, secrecy, and control rather than actual magic. That idea fits Silo surprisingly well. For generations, people inside the silos have been told what the outside world is like. They have been told what is safe. They have been told what is dangerous. They have been told what they are allowed to remember. And most importantly, they have been taught that questioning the system can destroy everything. But what if the person or system behind that curtain is much less powerful than everyone believes? This could completely change how we interpret Silo 1. The control structure has always seemed almost impossible to challenge because it has information, surveillance, communication, and the ability to punish entire populations. But that does not necessarily mean the people behind it understand everything. In fact, the more we learn, the more it feels like the system may be reacting to threats rather than controlling every event perfectly. And that brings us directly back to Juliet. Because Juliet is dangerous for one simple reason. She remembers. The forgetting process is supposed to separate people from the past. If someone cannot remember what they once knew, then they cannot easily connect old information with new discoveries. They become easier to control. But Juliet has already shown signs that this process is not absolute. That means the real threat she represents may not be her ability to escape or repair machinery. It may be her ability to connect the clues. And if the seashell symbol is one of those clues, then its importance could be much bigger than George's story. Because imagine that George discovered the symbol before Juliet ever understood its meaning. Imagine that he was following a trail that had been left behind by people who knew the truth about the silos. And imagine that the reason this trail was never completely erased is because the people controlling the system did not realize how many different pieces of information were connected. That would explain why the relics matter so much. It would also explain why the show keeps returning to objects that seem meaningless at first. A seashell, a relic, a drawing, a forbidden book, a strange piece of technology. Individually, none of these things can explain the entire silo mystery. But together, they may form a map. And if the Wizard of Oz comparison is intentional, then Juliet may not be searching for the wizard anymore. She may be searching for the curtain. But there is an even bigger problem. Because while Juliet is trying to recover the truth, someone else may be trying to erase it. And that is where vitamin D+ becomes much more disturbing. At first, it looks like a simple tool for controlling memory. But if the silos are built around controlling information, then a drug that can erase memories becomes much more than a punishment. It becomes a weapon against history itself. And that could mean the barrels everyone has been watching are not just part of another storyline. They could be one of the most important clues we have going into episode 7. Vitamin D+ looks harmless for one very simple reason. The name itself is designed to make people trust it. Vitamin D is something the human body actually needs, especially for people living underground with almost no natural sunlight. So when a substance called vitamin D+ appears inside the silo, the name feels almost comforting. But that may be exactly why it is so dangerous. Because if the substance is actually being used to affect memory, then the most important part of the drug is not what it does to the body. It is what it does to a person's understanding of their own past. Think about what that means in a society where history is already controlled. The people inside the silo do not simply lack information. They have been separated from information deliberately. They do not know what happened before the silo. They do not know the complete reason they were placed underground. They do not know who created the system. They do not even have a normal relationship with the idea of the outside world. Their reality has been constructed around missing pieces. And memory is the one thing that can connect those missing pieces. That is why vitamin D+ could be far more important than it first appears. If you can stop people from remembering what they saw, what they learned, or what they were told by someone else, then you do not have to destroy every piece of evidence. You simply have to make sure nobody can connect the evidence together. That is a much more efficient form of control. And this is where Juliet becomes such a serious problem. Juliet is not dangerous because she knows one secret. She is dangerous because she keeps connecting secrets. She connects George to the relics. She connects the relics to the past. She connects the past to the technology. She connects the technology to the people controlling the silo. And now she has begun to understand that the official story cannot explain everything she has seen. If her memories continue returning, then the system has a problem. Because every memory can become evidence. This could also explain why the treatment of memory has always been surrounded by so much fear. The silo does not merely punish people who ask questions. It creates an environment where forgetting is treated almost like a form of protection. That is a very important distinction. The system does not have to convince everyone that the truth is false. It only needs to make sure people cannot remember enough of it to challenge the official version. And that makes the vitamin D+ shipment especially suspicious. We know the barrels were deliberately moved through the silo. We know the substance eventually entered the water system. And we know that the timing matters because the story has been operating within a surprisingly compressed period. But there is another detail worth considering. The barrels themselves. Earlier in the story, the containers are clearly associated with vitamin D+. Later, their appearance raises questions because the labeling does not seem consistent. Now, there is a perfectly ordinary explanation for this. It could simply be a continuity or production mistake. Television shows sometimes contain those mistakes. But if the difference was intentional, then the implications become much bigger. Because someone may have switched the barrels. And if someone switched them, we immediately have another question. What was inside the replacement barrels? Was it still vitamin D+? Was it a different chemical? Was it something designed to counteract the memory treatment? Or was the entire shipment part of a much larger operation? At this point, we simply do not have enough confirmed information to answer that. But that uncertainty is exactly what makes the theory interesting. Because Silo has repeatedly shown us that objects can have two meanings. Something can look ordinary on the surface, while serving a completely different purpose underneath. The relics work this way. The books work this way. The outside suit works this way. Even the cleaning ritual works this way. Everything has an official explanation. And then, sooner or later, the characters discover another explanation. That pattern may be happening again with vitamin D+. There is also a fascinating connection between memory and the Wizard of Oz theory. In the original Oz story, the characters believe they need the wizard to give them something they already possess in some form. The journey is about discovering that the answer was hidden behind a false source of authority. Now apply that idea to Silo. What if the people inside the silo have been searching for answers from the wrong place? They believe the system has the answers. They believe the rules exist because someone knows what is best. They believe the past is dangerous because they have been told it is dangerous. But perhaps the real power comes from preventing them from asking the right question. And the right question may not be, what is outside? It may be, who decided what we are allowed to remember? That question changes everything. Because if memory is being controlled, then even a person who discovers the truth cannot necessarily share it with everyone else. Imagine Juliet discovering something that completely changes her understanding of the silo. She tells another person. That person understands it. But if the system can erase memories, the discovery can disappear without destroying the evidence. The person forgets. The system survives. That is why memory could be more important than physical imprisonment. You can escape a room. You can escape a silo. But escaping a system that controls what you remember is much harder. And this may explain why the people running the silo are so terrified of certain artifacts. An artifact does not need to be dangerous by itself. It only needs to trigger a memory. One object can remind someone of another object. That memory can lead to another question. That question can lead to another person. Eventually, an entire history can be reconstructed. And once enough people remember the same truth, control becomes much harder. This could be the real reason the system has survived for so long. Not because nobody ever discovered the truth, but because nobody was allowed to remember enough of it at the same time. That would make Juliet's survival much more significant. She may be carrying fragments of a history that the system expected to remain buried. And if those fragments continue coming back, then the next conflict may not be about whether Juliet can physically survive. It may be about whether she can remember everything before someone makes her forget again. But there is still one major piece missing from this puzzle. Who is actually controlling the information? Because if the Wizard of Oz comparison is correct, there has to be something behind the curtain. And the answer may be connected to the voice coming from the silo's control system. If that voice is not simply an automated AI, but a human operator, or a system controlled by humans, then the entire power structure of the silo could look very different. And that is where Episode 7 could become extremely important. Because the moment the characters realize that the voice has a human weakness, the wizard may finally begin to lose his power. And once you know there is a person behind the curtain, you can start looking for the curtain. Now we come to the theory that could connect everything we have discussed so far: the seashell, vitamin D+, the relics, the controlled memories, and the mysterious authority behind the silo system. For most of the story, the people inside the silo have assumed that someone or something is ultimately in control. The rules are too detailed. The surveillance is too extensive. The punishments are too coordinated. And the information between different parts of the system appears too carefully managed for everything to be random. But there is an important difference between being powerful and being all-powerful. The Wizard of Oz appeared to be almost unstoppable because nobody could see what was behind the curtain. His power came from distance, secrecy, and presentation. Once the curtain was pulled back, the image of the all-powerful wizard became much less impressive. That could be exactly what Silo is building toward. The people inside the silo may have spent generations believing that the system knows everything. But what if it doesn't? What if the system has simply become very good at making people believe that it knows everything? That would explain some of the strange reactions we have seen throughout the story. Whenever someone discovers something unexpected, the system does not always respond with a perfect solution.
Sometimes it reacts.
Sometimes it improvises. Sometimes it seems almost desperate to contain the situation before it spreads. And that is very different from an all-knowing machine. It suggests that whoever is behind the system may have limits. This is where the voice becomes extremely interesting. For a long time, it would be easy to assume that the mysterious voice is simply an advanced computer system. That explanation fits the world of Silo. The technology is sophisticated, surveillance is everywhere, and the people controlling the silo clearly have access to information that ordinary citizens do not. But the voice has also displayed strangely human qualities. It responds emotionally. It appears to understand context. It sometimes sounds almost conversational. And most importantly, there are moments when its timing feels less like an automated response and more like someone is actually sitting somewhere, listening and deciding when to answer. That does not prove that a human is behind it, but it gives us another possibility. Maybe the voice is not the wizard. Maybe the voice is simply the microphone connected to the wizard. And if that is true, then Silo 1 becomes much more important. We already know that Silo 1 occupies a unique position in the structure. It is not simply another ordinary silo. It appears to have a controlling or coordinating function over the others. That makes it the perfect location for the person behind the curtain. But again, we should be careful. The theory does not require one evil man sitting in a dark room controlling every single event. The reality could be much more complicated. It could be a group. It could be an automated system with human oversight. It could be a small number of people who inherited the responsibilities of the original founders. Or it could be something that has been operating for so long that even the people running it no longer completely understand why the original rules exist. And that last possibility may be the most interesting. Because what happens when a system created to protect humanity becomes more focused on protecting itself? At some point, the original purpose can disappear. The rules remain. The punishments remain. The memory controls remain. The fear remains. But nobody remembers the original reason. That would create the ultimate silo paradox. The people are trapped because they are afraid of discovering the truth. But the people controlling them may also be trapped by the same system. And this takes us back to the seashell. Maybe the symbol is not simply a clue to where the story is going. Maybe it represents the entire structure of the mystery. A spiral. You start at the outside and slowly move inward. George begins searching. Juliet continues searching. The relics reveal fragments. The books preserve forbidden ideas. The memory system tries to erase those ideas. The silos communicate with one another. Silo 1 sits at the center. And eventually someone has to reach the middle. That person may be Juliet. But she may not be the only one. Solo has spent years surrounded by information that most people never had access to. Bernard has learned things that he was never supposed to reveal. Other characters are beginning to realize that the official history does not explain their reality. The more people who begin connecting these pieces, the harder it becomes for the system to maintain the illusion. And that may be the real threat going into episode 7. Not an uprising. Not a monster. Not even an escape. Knowledge. Because knowledge spreads. And once enough people know the same secret, you cannot simply erase one person's memory and expect the system to remain safe. This is also why the vitamin D+ theory is so important. If the drug is genuinely being used to suppress memory, then whoever controls it understands the greatest weakness of the silo population. They understand that controlling information is not enough. You have to control memory. And if the mysterious barrels were somehow switched, then someone may have discovered a way to interfere with that process. That would create a fascinating conflict. One side is trying to erase the past. The other side is trying to recover it. And Juliet is standing directly in the middle. Now consider the title of the next episode, Radio. That title may be referring to something very simple. It could involve Martha Walker's radio. It could involve communication between characters. It could even connect to the events outside the silo. But radio has another important meaning in this story. Communication. A radio allows information to travel from one place to another. And that is exactly what the silo system has spent generations trying to control. Who can communicate? What they can communicate? Who can hear them? And what happens when they say something they are not supposed to say? So if episode 7 focuses heavily on radio communication, it could become another crack in the system. Because the moment information crosses the boundaries between silos, control becomes much harder. And that brings us to the biggest possibility. What if the silos were never meant to operate as completely separate worlds? What if they were always designed to communicate with a central authority? And what if that authority has been monitoring them for generations? Then the question becomes terrifyingly simple. What has Silo 1 been listening to all this time? Every conversation, every rebellion, every forbidden discovery, every person who questioned the rules, every attempt to uncover the past, and perhaps even every person who got close enough to discover the truth. If that is the case, then Juliet may already be on someone's list. But there is one thing the system may not have planned for. Juliet is not simply searching for an answer anymore. She is beginning to understand how the system works. And once you understand the mechanism of your prison, escaping becomes a completely different problem. The seashell may be the map. Vitamin D+, may be the weapon. The relics may be the evidence. And the Wizard of Oz may be the warning. Because behind every powerful system, there is eventually a curtain. And when that curtain finally moves, the people inside the silo may discover that the thing they feared for generations was never quite what they thought it was. The biggest mystery of Silo may therefore not be what is outside. It may be who is behind a curtain, and why they were so desperate to make everyone forget.